Good morning again. It's a pleasure to continue our program after the wonderful women we've already heard from this morning. It is my great pleasure to introduce the panel on the first women students at HDS. It's been just a gift to the school and to me as a historian to have the opportunity this year to focus on the accomplishments of the women who've graduated from this school over the last 50 years. We've had some wonderful events during our year-long celebration, including a number of distinguished alums who've returned to campus to give our named lectures, including Karen Baker Fletcher and Susanna Heschel. Emily Culpepper returned to this room for a recap of the showing of Period Piece, her MDiv senior thesis, which was a fantastic event. And most recently, Letty Russell, who we had hoped to be on this panel this morning, but couldn't be here for health reasons. But a month ago, she came to campus to deliver the Tillich Lecture. And this year marks both the 50th anniversary of Paul Tillich's arrival at Harvard Divinity School, as well as the 50th anniversary of women's admission to the school. Not a complete coincidence, as it was a real convergence of a theological renaissance that marked a new era in Protestant ecumenicism and in this school's role in that. And the women, of course, have been at the forefront of that. I've heard amazing stories this year and this morning about the accomplishments of our women graduates. As a group, you have been female first in almost every sector of American religion. A lot of those are incorporated into the video presentation that is running out in the hallway. I look forward to hearing more of those stories. Tell me sometime during the day today if there's one that I haven't heard yet. As a group, you have really contributed to the sea change in the practice of religion and religious thought that has come with women's entrance into religious leadership during this last momentous half century, and that continues, as we've seen with the panels earlier today. Somebody had to be first. Somebody had to be the first woman in every religious group to break every boundary. And the group that we have presenting today have a large number of those moments to remember and to tell us about and to give us the wisdom that came from those experiences. It wasn't always easy to be the first woman in whatever setting it was, but it made a huge amount of difference. Let me introduce the group of women that will be representing the many, many, many female boundary breakers that we have among the graduates of this school. Judith Hoehler is Minister Emerita of the First Parish Church in Weston, Massachusetts. She was a member of our first class that entered in 1955 and graduated with what was then called the Bachelor of Divinity degree in 1958. She's led a career as a religious educator, parish minister, and teacher, including a stint here at HDS as teaching preaching. Thank you. She received the Rabbi Martin Katzenstein Award together with her husband, Harry Hoehler, from HDS for their practice of learned, prophetic, and compassionate ministry in 1998. And she's a former member of the National Board of the United States Interreligious Committee for Peace in the Middle East and a former member of the Board of Overseers of Bowdoin College. She's currently a tutor in the Boston Public Schools and president of the NWW Committee for Community Living, which provides housing and services for adults with developmental disabilities. I'm going to go ahead and introduce all the panelists, and then I'm going to sit down and listen to their speakers. After Judy, we will hear from Joyce Mann Mazur. Joyce came to the Divinity School in 1955 after graduating from Radcliffe College, and has retired from a career on the front lines of raising the next generation as a secondary school teacher, and she lives in Western Massachusetts. After her time at HDS, she pursued graduate fellowships in summer programs at Stanford University, Bowdoin College, and Princeton University. And she taught for 25 years in the Quaboag Regional High School in Warren, Massachusetts, before retiring in 2000. Rena Karefa-Smart was the first African-American woman to receive the doctorate from Harvard Divinity School. But before that, she was already a distinguished figure in the international ecumenical student. She had been the first African-American woman to graduate from Yale Divinity School some 30 years earlier in the 1940s, after which she played a key role in the organization of the World Council of Churches. And in 1948, at their very first assembly, she delivered a dramatic prayer that people still remember and that became part of their 50th anniversary celebration service a few years ago. After graduating from Harvard, she was the first tenured woman professor at Howard University School of Divinity and the first person to be naturalized by the independent government of Sierra Leone. Her teaching appointments include Hood Theological Seminary, University College of Sierra Leone, Wellesley College, Boston University, and Princeton Theological Seminary. She currently provides counseling and outreach to displaced Sierra Leonean families and works with the development of networks for post-war reconciliation and reconstruction in Sierra Leone. She is a retired Episcopal priest and resident in the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, D.C. Marianka Fousek, the next in our distinguished panel this morning, emigrated from Prague to the United States after the close of World War II and before the communist coup in 1948. She attended Wellesley College as a history major and received the Master of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary. She holds the distinction of being the first woman student to be a doctoral student at Harvard Divinity School and received the THD here in 1960. She later taught at several colleges and universities, including Lenoir Rhine College, Duke University, and Miami University in Ohio. She served on a study commission and recommended the ordination of women in the Lutheran Church, and then became the Evangelical Lutheran Church's first ordained woman pastor in Michigan. Since retiring in 1998, she has taught continuing education programs in the Chicago area. Finally, Constance Parvey, it seems, has never really left the Divinity School. I'm so happy to say, as I have benefited from that since I arrived here 8 or 9 years ago. Connie is the retired Lutheran chaplain at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She came to HDS to pursue a Bachelor of Divinity and graduated in 1963. She also holds a BA from the University of Minnesota and a Master's in Social Work from Bryn Mawr. Prior to her arrival at MIT, she held numerous ministerial roles in Vermont, British Columbia, and Wisconsin, and also taught at HDS, Lutheran Theological Seminary, Temple University, Bryn Mawr, and other institutions. Many of us know her for the very important role she has played in the international ecumenical movement, heading up the study commission of the World Council of Churches in Geneva as director of the study on the community of women and men in the church that produced the historic Sheffield Report under her leadership. Now I get to sit down and hear what I have been waiting for, the stories of a really remarkable group of the first women students. Judy.
In the fall of 1955, Harvard Divinity School welcomed its largest incoming class up to that time, 122 students, of which for the first time in its history, there were 7 full-time students who were women. By the time I returned to teach thematic preaching in the spring of 1986, women made up approximately 50% of the student body. But that was not the only change that had occurred in the intervening years. Whereas in the 1950s, most of us came to the Divinity School right out of college, with perhaps a 2 or 3 year hiatus at the most, by the late 80s, many more were coming to ministry as a second career, having already spent 10 or 20 years in the workforce, raising children, practicing another profession. This wealth of life experience made preaching classes far more interesting than I remembered them as a student. Other changes were in the physical plant. The Andover Harvard Library, in which we on the panel studied, resided right here in the Sperry Room and the adjacent Pfeiffer Room, differently configured, but essentially taking up this end of Andover Hall. There was no Rockefeller Hall, no World Religious Center. The dean's residence still housed the university press, and coeducational living in Divinity Hall was unthinkable. The school rented the Francis Avenue home of John Kenneth Galbraith, then ambassador to India, for the new dean, Douglas Horton. And 2 of us, Letty Russell and I, were given rooms there. This enabled us to get to know Mildred McAfee Horton. There were no women faculty at Harvard Divinity School then, and Mrs. Horton, who had been president of Wellesley College, was an outspoken role model. During the Second World War, she had founded the women's branch of the Navy, the Waves. And during our first month at HDS, she invited the women students to tea because, she said, it might benefit us to hear her experiences on breaking into an all-male world. It was an exciting time to be at the Divinity School. With the women came also Paul Tillich, Paul Lehman, James Luther Adams, Frank Ross, and Richard Niebuhr, George Florovsky. A year or so earlier had come Christa Stendahl, Amos Wilder, Conrad Wright, and George Buttrick in a sweeping change under Harvard President Nathan Pusey that catapulted HDS from being a small outpost of liberal ministry into a major center of theological education. It was a time of great intellectual ferment, not only in the classroom, but outside as well. Students gathered in informal study groups to critique the ambiguity in Tillich's idea of ultimate concern, the different concepts of analogy in Tillich, Barth, and Aquinas, the religionless Christianity of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Faculty frequently joined these discussions. I remember one evening a group of us Unitarian and Universalist students argued with Paul Tillich that, based on his systematic theology, he could not be a Trinitarian, but had to be a Unitarian. Another informal group, this one with Professor Paul Lehman, focused on the meaning of Revelation. This discussion got so complicated that it went on for 3 sessions. Through my 40 years in parish ministry, I have been grateful for the grounding HDS gave me in how to think theologically and how to wrestle with biblical texts. There were areas for which the Harvard of the 50s did not prepare us. No department of the ministry, very little on worship and liturgy, no clinical pastoral education. But for the battles that were looming just over the horizon, the civil rights movement, gender-inclusive language, patriarchy in the churches, to name but three. The ability to think theologically and biblically, to carry one's questions always on the other side of the coin of one's affirmations. This was a great gift from HDS. We on the panel are often asked what it was like to be the first women at HDS, so I would like to close with a story that involves Letty Russell. It captures the ambiguity that pervaded this campus back then. The Presbyterians had just voted to ordain women, and Letty wanted Paul Lehman to preach her ordination sermon. Professor Lehman had always welcomed our full participation in class, but we also knew that as a Presbyterian, he was skeptical of women's ordination. But he was fond of Letty, and he agreed to deliver the sermon. The service was in the Church of the Ascension in the East Harlem Protestant Parish in New York City, and Professor Lehman preached on the text, then universally attributed to St. Paul, that women keep silent in the churches. The sermon, in effect, was Paul Lehman's attempt to come to terms with women's ordination. And about 3/4 of the way through the sermon, Horace Allen, who was sitting next to me, leaned over and whispered, "My word, I think he's going to come down against ordaining Letty." Of course, he did not. Instead, he took the Gamaliel-like stance that if what we were doing that day was of God, then Letty's ministry would bear fruit. If not, which I always considered a bit of a burden to take away from one's ordination. But of course, Letty Russell's ministry did bear fruit, and her writings and her career as a premier feminist and liberation biblical theologian span the decades that we celebrate today. Thank you.
Good morning. I am the woman who did not stay. I arrived at Harvard Divinity School in September 1955, then left early without a theology degree. And I did not subsequently receive a theology degree anywhere else. Nevertheless, Deborah Metcalf in the alumni office was very persuasive about my participating here today anyway. Of course, I feel very humbled to be at this table with these distinguished ministers and professors of religion, these women who did not leave early. As I look back at my only year at HDS, I realized that I had misinterpreted my dynamic personal faith. I thought I had received a call to professional life in the church. By the end of the first semester, most of which I loved, I knew that I had no call at all for church leadership, whether as a missionary teacher or as a parish minister. I did stay until the end of that first year, continuing to enjoy learning the Hebrew language with Dr. Charles Foreman to complement my college Greek and Latin, and continuing to enjoy George Williams' wonderful church history class. So, a seminary degree was certainly not appropriate for me, yet continued religious studies have been appropriate in my life, both formally and informally. The current parlance, the cliches, if you will, would have it that I have been on a long-distance faith journey, a spiritual path. Those religious travels began in childhood and have continued through more than 7 decades, with a significant stopping place at Harvard Divinity School in 1955-56. I am happy to say that I have been very fortunate, and wonderful mentors in religion have graced my life these past 50 years. Of course, I want to mention Mann Mazur. I also want to acknowledge the role of a couple of brilliant women ministers in the tradition of these brilliant women seated here. Let me look back at the 1950s at Harvard University as a whole. What about the gender wars? Well, there were no gender wars. There was a status quo, 1950s style, and you don't have to have been alive then to know what that was all about. There were a few changes, though, that were happening. When I was an undergraduate here, there was much rejoicing because the academic experience for men and women had become integrated. We were all in classes together. Incidentally, we were not men and women then. In those days, it was college boys and college girls. I don't have time to detail the areas of college life that were not yet integrated. Some of those details do seem very funny, though, now. One area of Harvard-Radcliffe life was not at all integrated, and the discrimination was not at all funny. This story is well known here at the Divinity School, and I'm going to tell it now because I was involved. In those days, we women students in the undergraduate college were not permitted to attend the weekday morning prayers over in Appleton Chapel. We women were required to sit in the adjoining Memorial Church and listen to the scripture readings, the hymns, the homily, the prayers through a partition. This outrage felt terrible to all of us at that time, and it still feels terrible as I remember the insult. No wonder so many of us threw ourselves into the women's liberation movement a decade later, and on and on. As for the Divinity School itself, my guess is that an egalitarian ethos has pretty much prevailed over the decades. I have heard Judy Hoehler say that professors were very accepting of her and Letty and the others. Male students accepted them also. I'm going to conclude with one little HDS story, though. I wonder how many women students over the decades here had the rather humorous gender encounter I experienced on my first day in this building in September 1955. It was the first day of classes, and I went to see my advisor, dear Ralph Lazaro. When I walked into the waiting area, 3 first-year male students were already sitting there. One of the men, quite a bit older than the rest of us, greeted me with Dr. Johnson's words. A woman preacher is like a dog dancing on its hind legs. It's not a matter of doing it well. It's that she'd even be able to do it at all. The famous story was told in a humorous tone, and I knew it was meant as a joke. Still, well now, I have placed my own colorful tile in today's mosaic of remembering, and now it's Rena's turn.
I'd like to greet everyone who's here and say I'm full of joy because of this return and the invitation that brought me here. I've tried to keep in touch over the years, but as you can see, there have been many, many years, and there are gaps in my understanding of the efforts and the energy that have gone forth in order that women at Harvard Divinity School not only be a real presence, but be a body of those in learning who forever after are changing the contours of theological education and ministry, Christian ministry in this country. But I should tell you that I'm kind of an interloper. I usually seem to get wherever I'm going at the time when much of the struggle is over. And I'm therefore able to enjoy the fruits of the struggle. And that is true of my sojourn here at Harvard Divinity School. You know the history. I don't need to repeat it. I was here in the 70s. And you know that the turning point came in the 50s. And much of the progress that followed had been made by the time I arrived here. And I'd like to say my forte is not fulfilling a 6-minute assignment. And so I'm going to suggest that I simply indicate 4 areas that I would like to discuss if anyone has questions or wants to dialogue, rather than developing those areas now. And before I do that, I want to introduce to you my partner in life, John Karefa-Smart, who's sitting way up there in the back. And also sitting next to him is our daughter, Rosalie Karefa-Smart, who's on kind of competitive territory. She's a Wellesley grad. And finally, we thought we might see our younger daughter, Suzanne, who was a Cliffy and was through with her studies here at the time, so that she was in the commencement that I was in 76. So she's a Sixer. Finally, the family information. John was faculty when I was here, so I was a faculty wife. Those are my connections with this marvelous institution. My background is transnational, Caribbean parent, West African husband, and African American woman. And that mix has made for a fascinating journey on which I still travel, and I hope I'll be on it for some time soon. But the theological education portion of it has been shaped by my life in the church. And so I'm on a faith journey, not in the sense that that is used today, but you will understand what I mean when I say learning to think theologically, for me, has grown out of a faith commitment which is overarching and which has shaped my decisions in life, whether family, personal, or professional, including theological education, and finally that, ministry in the church. One word about the ministry portion. I was brought up in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. My father was a pastor in that church. My mother was very active in missions and all the good things that women do. And it was very natural for me to see women in ministry. They'd always been ordained since the 1800s in the AME Zion Church. And one of my role models was the Reverend Zoe A. Walters, who was a presiding elder of the New England Conference, presiding elder meaning assistant to the bishop. So it was not for me necessary to struggle, although I didn't really understand the thinking of the AME Zion Church, because though they had such a marvelous beginning, they still don't have a woman bishop, although the African Methodist Episcopal Church now has 3. So if you know anything about the historic Black Methodist churches, you will be able to read between the lines and see what I mean by saying all is not well in Zion. But there were auspicious beginnings, and we have hope for the future. Coming to Harvard Divinity School for me was not my first intent at all. I may be the only person in the world for whom Harvard Divinity School was a second choice. And that is because one September morning, I was awake. Our 3 young people were all accounted for in their universities. My faculty husband had gone off to his office in the School of Public Health at Harvard. And the question for me is, what are you going to do now? The nest is really empty. And then I thought, well, you have lots of academic unfinished business, because when I was at Yale Divinity School, I had completed the Bachelor of Divinity program and had that degree, but I'd stayed on a couple of years because I was doing post-BD studies in sociology, working toward my doctorate. And then the ecumenical movement, embodied in John Karefa-Smart, came along, and I had to interrupt that and off to Africa and family and children raising and all of that. So now we're speaking the 70s, and this hiatus represented for me the point at which I could decide what to do with my life. And so I went across the river, and everything was set up for my study program. My buddies were there, my ecumenical buddies, Walter Mulder and Paul Dietz and so on. And it was just exciting until one of them said, but Rena, we don't have any money. And I thought, end of the road. Here I am with 3 young people in university, no way to divert family income for whatever I think I need to do. But the next morning I was led to cross the river, come to the Divinity School, which I'd never visited, and the first person I met was Jim Fowler, Methodist, working in the areas that I was interested in. He was working on following up his doctoral dissertation, I believe, on H. Richard Niebuhr. Now, H. Richard Niebuhr had been my major professor at Yale Divinity School at the time that I was studying with Liston Pope. And when Jim heard my story, he said, aren't you a Kent fellow? And I said, yes. He picked up the phone and he called St. Louis and he talked to Kent Underwood and said to me, how many years of your fellowship money did you use? Your tuition? And I said, 1 year. He said, well, you're eligible for 3. So here we are, 2 years of tuition, and I was able, therefore, to fulfill the requirements as a registered graduate unclassified first, and then in the doctoral program. Now, the RGU was because I showed up sight unseen. I was unknown. I was not invited. And, more to the point, I was unpublished. And so the question, I think, amongst the faculty, you'll have to ask Preston Williams, because he's the one who bailed me out in the end, and Ralph Potter and Arthur Dyke. The 3 of them worked very hard with me. And the decision was, start as an RGU, and we'll see what you do, and you see what we do. And at the end of this term, you may then move into the doctoral program. Well, that's what happened. So I didn't cross ICCs, but I stood the test those first few weeks and then moved into the program. So I just wanted you to know that I'm atypical. I didn't choose Harvard, but Harvard was made possible for me, and I am forever grateful, because when I walked into this building and went to the library and then went to the Widener Library, it was like a Christmas tree. It was so exciting. I'd been in wonderful libraries before, but this is, of course, as you know, although it hurts me to say so, preeminent. I still have some loyalties. In any case, I was well on my way. Quickly, what was I concerned about? In the ecumenical movement, we were very clear about our beliefs, but we understood that the practices of those beliefs, both in church and society, were woefully unsuccessful. And my focus was racism, because in the ecumenical movement, some of us had created the program to combat racism, which was a worldwide movement, and we had been very much criticized because the theological underpinnings of the program were not clarified. and the World Council of Churches office was abuzz with these Americans. There were 2 or 3 of us, who were so atypical in the way they went around doing ecumenical work without being able to clarify and justify it as we should. And so this opportunity was given to me to focus in my program of studies on racism. And I'm interested that UNESCO and other groups had already laid foundations, but the word hasn't gotten around, because last night I heard the word race being used as though it exists. And one of the things I learned and developed in my dissertation is that that's really the biggest con job in Western thought, if you allow my using street language, so to speak. There is no such thing. But I couldn't think that through until I had the years 1971 to 76 here at the Divinity School to find the evidence for that claim, that there is no such thing as race. So the racism which we were trying to do away with is always a phenomenon which is almost impossible to come to terms with, much less eliminate, because our thought patterns are so tenacious in terms of non-scientific terminology and ways of identifying the problem. Nonetheless, with the World Council experience and that practical application of Christian ethics and the opportunity given to me to draw back, not only because of burnout, but also because of my intellectual needs, and to understand what it is we're talking about, what the phenomenon is, not only in this country but worldwide, then it seemed to me I was ready after 76 to again begin applied ethics and ministry. Finally, I came as a layperson to Harvard Divinity School and left as a layperson. However, there had always been this query of my friends and colleagues about my decision to remain a layperson. And eventually, by 1979, as I continued in the church milieu to try to help abolish racism, Christian racism by now I was able to call it, because of the church's situation. By that time, I had been drawn more and more to the parish and to life in the parish, and decided that I would seek ordination. My way of doing it, though, was to go to the authorities in both the AME Zion Church and the Episcopal Church, because when I was here at the Divinity School, we moved from Francis Avenue, where we had a place, to Weston. And in Weston, I went to the Episcopal Church, and for years had been a layperson in the Episcopal Church whenever we lived in a place somewhere in the world where there was no AME Zion Church. So after 20 years of that experience, I went to both denominations and said, in effect, hey guys, come on, let's do, a dual ordination together. There's nothing that would prevent that in the ecclesiology or other manifestations of group life in either of these communions. So can't we do it? The AME Zion Church, you'll be interested to know, said, absolutely not. We are not interested in losing our identity, and we are going to ordain you now. They said, you're training ordinands, you're doing all the things that are necessary, you're ready. And so they did. The Episcopal Church, on the other hand, said, you know what? This is something about which we must pray and politic. And I said, please, will you politic and I'll pray. And so when I went to Washington, D.C., John Walker, the late John Walker, was the bishop of the diocese, and he had been AME until he was 22, so he understood exactly where I was coming from. And he said, however, can't cut you any slack, go through the program, and then we'll see. And so while I was being presiding elder in the AME Zion Church, I was doing the ordination process for the Episcopal Church, and in the end it all worked out well. By 1988, I was ordained in both communions. Now, I have unfinished business. My hope is that each communion will recognize my credentials in the other, and that they will consider joint ordinations. And I think that's an item that is legitimate, but that it needs a great deal of prayer as well as politicking. Finally, I said I was unpublished when I came here, and I'm still unpublished except for the odd article now and then. But I'm not disappointed, because when it was time for the degree to be awarded, my mentors spoke with me, and I said, I think, to Professor Potter, what can I expect of myself? You know, here I am, 55. I'm not a scholar. I'm a generalist. I think I can claim that. And I have knowledge of the area that I'm working in, and so on. And he said, well, some well-polished articles would be expected. And I loved that, because it meant I didn't feel I had to prove anything, certainly things that were not true. Now, as the late John Walker used to say, I think there is a book inside me. That's because my husband and I published one in 1958 together. And the demands of his life have been such that we've not been able to continue our joint work. He has, of course, done some publishing. And my hope is that now that I'm really retired, I may be able to do something which will not have a vertical file for me, of course, but one little line that says, it was not all in vain in terms of how to think theologically in terms of this whole area of racism and its elimination, both from church and from society, because that is my hope. I've gone over my time, I know, but I thank you very much for listening, and from your faces, I think at least I haven't put you to sleep. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, okay. Before I start kind of story of my pilgrimage, I want to make a correction to my bio. I feel bad about it. And I'm not faulting anybody, but I spent 16 years in the ministry at Chicago Uptown Ministry. And I consider that much more important than all the years of my academic career. So I don't know whether this was the academic prejudice of Harvard or what. It just doesn't appear in my little bio. So it was a wonderfully enriching experience. I loved it, every minute of it. I finally retired from it, not because I was tired of it, but I was tired. I worked with homeless people, mentally ill people, the food pantry. I was the editor of a newsletter, and I had a wonderful time. I can't say that about my academic experience. I'll tell you a little bit, not very seriously, about my experiences in life, how I came about to be a theologian and stuff, but I want to emphasize the lighter side. I come from a non-religious family. My mother was Jewish, from a non-practicing Jewish family, and my father was a fallen-away Catholic, and I was brought up in plain nothing. And but I missed the luminous, the transcendent, or whatever in my life. And at the age of 8, I started believing in God. I saw this wonderful sunset, and I said, this couldn't have come about by accident. But I had to hide my religious beliefs and practices from my family. I was ashamed of it, I knew that they didn't have a high opinion of it. Any case, by the age of 12 or 13, I decided I wanted to be a priest. I was Catholic by then. I didn't mention that, right? My parents decided to have me baptized because they thought, foolishly or naively, that it would protect us, the Jewish part of the family, from Hitler. Well, of course, it didn't protect anybody. But I loved it. But except I wanted to be a priest. And I knew that women couldn't be priests in the Catholic Church, and that if I became a Protestant, I would be damned. That's what I was taught. So I had a wonderful solution to the problem. I was going to found my own church. So then I wouldn't be damned because I wouldn't be a Protestant, right? But I could be ordained. Any case, it took a while before I had to, work out a different concept of the church. And then I could be a Protestant. And hopefully one day be ordained. And that's what happened. I was fascinated by theology, and I wanted to study it. By the age of, 18 or something, I was heading for the PhD. I don't know whether I knew exactly what it meant, but I wanted to solve all theological questions. So, I went through Wellesley and Union and then Harvard, and it was kind of, the Harvard thing was almost an accident. My college teacher pushed me into it and got me a scholarship, and there I was. Now, my experience with Harvard Divinity School wasn't traumatic or nothing. I wasn't even a conscious a feminist. I just thought it was natural for a woman to do these things, And the professors didn't give me a hard time. They were just some of them were very funny. And I thought I'd share a couple of stories about how you were treated as a woman in those days. One was a wonderful story about my encounter with Professor Arthur Darby Nock. He was there, for those of you who didn't know him, he was a kind of an odd fellow, a great scholar, and a little strange. And he said, a woman will graduate from Harvard Divinity School only over my dead body. I did not take any courses with him. But of course, I knew who he was. And I knew about him through the Stenders mainly, who were his great friends. Now, when I passed my journals for the doctorate, I was somehow in Widener Library. I don't know why. Maybe the exam was there. In any case, I was standing there somewhere in the lobby and apparently beaming. And here comes Professor Darby Nock. And he notices my smile and said, "Something good happened to you?" He didn't know me from the hole in the ground. And I said, "Yeah, I just passed my journals." And he beamed and he reached out with his hand and he said, "Let me be the first one to congratulate you." Apparently he forgot that he was supposed to be dead. The reason why I'm sharing this with you is because it gives you hope that people can change, that things can change. Anyway, he said to me, "Do you know who I am?" And of course it was so funny, everybody knew who he was. He was totally unself-conscious as a famous figure. And I, in my excitement, couldn't think of his name. So what do I say? And I came up with a wonderful answer, apparently. I said, "Yes, you're a great friend of the Stenders." He was so delighted. He beamed and walked off into the air saying, friend of Krista Stendhal, I made his day, apparently. Yeah. But, it really does give you hope. That things don't have to stay, and people don't have to stay the same. I am a little cynic. I certainly don't believe in progress. But when I look back at my life, things have changed, and some of them for the better. It really is incredible. Not only, in very short years, the position of women in the church as well as in society, but the Catholic Church has changed for the better. The relationship of Jews and Christians have markedly improved. And I am teaching courses now at this, in the, what do you call it, continuing education seminars on the Jewishness of early Christianity. And I have mobs of students, relatively speaking. It's called Siblings or Strangers, Jews and Christians in the First Century, or in the beginning. And I have both Jewish and Christian students, and, I can make a difference, And for this, I have to thank, again, Krista Stendhal, because he was the first person who showed me the Jewishness of early Christianity. And he was the first one to whom I dared to admit that I was Jewish. Because I was ashamed of it before. And I was afraid how people would treat me. And it kept brewing in my head. And then when I was through finally with my boring teaching in colleges, I thought, one day I want to teach about this. And that's what I'm able to do now after I retired. And I feel this much more worthwhile than any of the truly academic teaching that I did for 16 hard years. The academic career was very hard for me. I was usually the first woman on the faculty in the Department of Religious Studies, and I was not part of the boys' club, and I never got tenure anywhere. And I didn't know how to play politics. I say things as what I think. After my father, I'm afraid. My mother was very diplomatic, not me. But any case, I was saying to a friend recently, I said, I had an unsuccessful career. I was not very successful in my career. And she said, why? I said, well, I never got tenure anywhere. And she looked at me and said, and if you had gotten tenure, supposing the first place where you taught, and you would have been stuck there for the rest of your life? She said, just think what a rich life you had. You went to so many different places. And you saw so much and experienced so much, and your horizons have broadened. And I saw my life, my professional life, in a completely different light at that point. I had a very rich life. I still have a rich life. Poor colleagues of mine who didn't make it. So I feel blessed, and I just wanted to share this with you because it gives you a lot of hope. Things that look very bad sometimes in life, and you feel your failure, and you feel, you have no idea what you should be differently, or if I should, I certainly can't do it. In the end, it might prove a blessing.
Wow. So nice to have the opportunity to see a lot of friends that I know and don't know in this gathering. It's really a privilege. What was it like at the Divinity School in 1956, 55? I'm just going to tell a couple of stories. One, I didn't know that there weren't women at the Divinity School. I had come from the University of Minnesota via Vanderbilt, and there were women in the theology school at Vanderbilt at the time. It didn't occur to me that there wouldn't be women at the Divinity School, so I signed up for a special class. I think I entered as a special student or something like that. I think my first course was with one of my first courses. I was working full-time for the University Lutheran Ministry of Greater Boston and the whole of New England. So I was doing a great deal of traveling, animating local groups on campuses, Dartmouth, Amherst, Holyoke, Smith, going all around. So I was traveling a great deal. Anyway, my first course that I remember very vividly was a course with Krister Stendahl. I had never read the Bible. I didn't know anything about the Bible. I came from an agnostic family. We went fishing and played cards on Sunday and visited relatives and played and sang and did music. My father was a fine musician. So we just had, Sunday was fun day because, you worked the rest of the week and you took off on Sunday. So we didn't go to church. I didn't have any real interest in religion. I thought people who went to church were awfully conventional and that you didn't need that kind of support, I didn't see it at all. That wasn't where I was coming from. I suppose I did have this kind of mystical sense because I grew up on the Dakota Plains in a little town of 300 people, and both of my grandfathers were homesteaders. So I would sit on the side porch in the evening and watch the sun go down, and I could see the Pacific Ocean. And then in the morning, I'd go to the other side where we had some white birch trees, and I'd see through them, and I'd see the Atlantic Ocean. But especially the sunset was very, very vivid. So I sort of knew that and then the dark nights out on the farm, where you can see this clear sky that none of us can see anymore. You have to go maybe in the middle of Kansas, maybe you can see that canopy of the stars. So where do you get inside of you this sense for this great jewel of a planet that we live in? I think that got implanted very early. But what I wanted to say was I took this course from Krister Stendahl, and it was time for the exam. Well, I didn't know anything. I thought I'm going to skip the exam. And so Marianka was in the class, and Krister said, well, where is Connie? Oh, she's not coming today. She's not taking the exam. So he gave you a dime or a nickel or whatever it was to make a phone call, and she called me up and said, Krister expects you in class to take this exam. So I came over and did the exam. He must have been very generous. But I mean that I passed. And so that was kind of my start, and I got very interested in it after that. And I must say that one of the gifts that the Divinity School gave me was this appreciation of biblical texts. And I have to thank the whole biblical department for that, because that's been a lifelong gift to work with text and exegesis and preaching and going from the ancient experience to the modern experience and seeing how similar and how different they are from each other. It's been a great richness to my life, and I thank the Divinity School for that. The second story I'd like to tell is that I was the dean of I'm one of those no child left behind people. I was in my junior year in college at the University of Minnesota, and I met Dean Rogers in front of the science building one day, and he asked me, "How are you, Connie?" And I said, and I gave him all my complaints about the university. And he said, "The trouble with you, Connie, is you ask why questions, and we only deal with how questions in this university." Wow. He said, "Come and see me." Picking up the kid left, it was really, deans and professors can be so important in one's life. And I wanted to tell that story because it got me going. He said, "Come to my office." He had me apply for a Danforth Fellowship. I got the fellowship, So anyway, but that's the other story I wanted to say. We were visiting in the Danforth home. It was called the Danny-Grad at that time. That was before the Kent Fellowship program. And so I said to K.I. Brown, I said, "Well, this is a program that doesn't lead you to any kind of degree and to any what you could do anything." And he said, "Well, it's not really. These aren't." He said, "We really can't afford to invest in women because they get married and have children, and they're not a long-term investment." That was the essence of what he said, and I was so shocked at that idea. But that was the thinking of the time. During my time here at the Divinity School, one of the advantages of not having a Rockefeller building where we had our own place to eat was that we ate over at Harkness Commons. And although there were very few women in the Divinity School, I got to know a lot of women in the university. One of the women I got to know was a pathologist. And she had a terrible time at the medical school because they didn't think a woman was capable of, doing what pathologists do. She couldn't deal with cadavers and, cutting them all up. That kind of thing. Anyway, she was having a very difficult time. And then I remember a woman from the philosophy department who was working on her doctorate, and that's a signal to stop, was working on her doctorate, and she became pregnant. And it was an uproar in the departments among the other graduate students. How could you possibly be pregnant and study for your PhD? Especially the generals and the oral exams. So those are just to give you an idea of the ethos of the time. But I do want to say a couple of other things about the Divinity School. For me, this whole idea of the struggle between faith and reason, this couldn't have been a better place for me. It was a tremendous renaissance with Tillich, with Cross, with Wright, with the John the 23rd and William's interest in the whole ecumenical dimensions and renewal of the church, with George Florovsky and bringing us the Russian tradition and the Russian liturgy. I learned so much from him about liturgy and helped me to understand and work on liturgy. Later in my life, I was on the president's representative on the board for what's now the Green Hymnal. And I just was so appreciative of having that training from in that getting to live in an ancient tradition that's still alive and vital was very exciting for me. Anyway, and also I do want to say the work of Tillich, especially the way in which he brought psychological and sociological and political language to the theological discourse, made theology make sense in a way that I'm not sure I would have caught on had I started at the other end with, redemption and salvation and sin and grace. I don't think I would have made it, folks. And then the last thing I want to say is that I was very interested in international affairs. I had spent my junior year abroad working on the rehabilitation of German youth after the Second World War, and I had traveled quite a bit at that point and spent some time in Mexico. So I'd gotten to see the ravages of war and I'd gotten to see the ravages of extreme poverty. I mean, the Mexico was so much worse than the devastation in Europe. I mean, it still wells up in me, that experience of seeing those people in the countryside and in the barrios eking out an existence. So I was interested, and I was involved in the World Student Christian Federation. And so when I came here, I found an international spirit, and that helped me a great deal because it was the time of President Pusey, and it brought people here from different parts of the world, and it expanded all of that, and that led to my involvement in the National Council and the World Council of Churches. And so this was a great place to plant the seed and to take root and to live that wonderful, I think it's Rabbi Ben-Ziki, he said there are only 3 questions in the world. Where do you come from? Where are you going? And to whom you have to reckon. That's, I think, all I have to say. Thank you.
Wow. This has been an incredible panel, so much so that we forgive our fantastic panelists. We particularly appreciate those of you who stuck to 6 minutes. And for those of you who did not, we feel so enriched that we will ask our questions over lunch. Because we've already gone beyond our time, we're not going to have a discussion at this point, but we do hope you'll have a chance to follow up with all of these wonderful presentations over lunch. Speaking of lunch, you may have noticed that it's raining. We still are going to be having lunch under the tent outside, but we will have a slight change in protocol from previous years because we don't want you to line up at the buffet, which will take you out into the rain. So if you will just have a seat at the tables, we'll call each table up to come to the buffet so that you don't get wet. One other announcement, there is a green Nissan Sentra out on Francis Avenue with the lights on. Massachusetts license plate 6637RK. And finally, I just can't thank this panel enough for we have been enriched, inspired, and I think we know a little bit more about who we are and where we're going. And we have quite a group to reckon with here, in addition to our more ultimate concerns. This group has taken us to some of the earliest years. We also want, Deb Metcalf, our alumni director, has printed Harvard Divinity School kazoos, which you can take as you leave this room, along with copies of the wonderful Newsweek article of 1971 on pronoun envy about the Harvard Divinity students who made history by... Other side? Well, I still have a lot to learn about inclusive language, which is the purpose of these. We won't be hearing them at lunch when Margaret Miles is speaking, I'm sure. But if we need them later in the day, they're there. Or if you need them later in life, please take one. Thank you again so much, and we'll see you at lunch.